itself is a modern Western assumption.
Good. Oh yeah, yeah. So very good. You've put your finger on something that's important. Um though I think you might be overreading it just slightly.
Okay.
Um and it is something that he doesn't develop here, that he develops elsewhere and that becomes more important later. So we'll have to keep an eye out for it. Um so he doesn't do it here in a number of different texts, and we'll bump into it. We'll bump into it in a few weeks, actually. Lonergan's going to make a distinction between the world mediated by meaning and the world constituted by meaning. And he's using world kind of in if you know your Heidegger in the sense of Welt, right? You could say horizon too if you want. Um, and so later on, Lonergan is going to say, um, yeah, really only infants have a kind of immediate perceptual interaction with the world. That as soon as language starts to get on board, um, even perception is mediated by meaning. So, I mean, he doesn't use this idiom, but you could use a kind that again that kind of phenomenological language of as structure, right? That you see things as and so forth.
Right.
Um, and so why do I think you might be overreading this? He's not saying that that there isn't a transcultural problem at that level. Um, but he's saying, but the problem gets more serious when you move into the
Okay.
horizon.
Okay. Okay. I get the distinction. Okay.
Yeah, so that
Yeah.
and that's the other part is there's a whole part of human living. It's the greater part of human living actually that takes place in a horizon of things that are not just mediated to us by meaning, but they're constituted by meaning.
Yeah.
What they are ontologically is made up of what they mean to us. Lonergan's example he uses is a court of law, right? You can go into a court of law.
I would just say that that's everything, though. Like we that the world that we perceive as a world of meanings. There's no. I just
So he's talking about on the side of the object, though,
yeah,
right?
I know, but I don't believe in the subject object distinction.
Oh, sure. Well, again, this isn't a separation, right? It's the distinction isn't between an in here and an out there for Lonergan. It's
Mhm.
between operation and the phenomenology the intendens, right? The noema. Um, so when I say side of the object, I don't mean some kind of flat-footed kind of Cartesian res extensa, res cogitans kind of thing. Lonergan is really trying to get away from that. Um, so again, don't mishear, right? It's not that the Welt of the human being isn't once we exit infancy totally saturated by meaning. I mean, completely saturated, except for maybe like every once in a while when you like hit your head on a cabinet in the kitchen, right? There are these kind of eruptions of animality. Um, you miss a step at the bottom of the stairs. But they're few and far between. Most of the time, it's totally saturated by meaning. The difference is that is a distinction between. Well, here, let's do it theologically. Maybe this will help ameliorate some of your concern. Ontologically, all of reality, you are right, is constituted by meaning. But not all of reality is constituted by human meanings, according to Lonergan.
Right.
All of reality is constituted by divine meaning. And if you want to do Christology with that, have fun. Because you super can. Lonergan doesn't, but you could. Um, but in the human world, some things which are constituted by divine meaning are only mediated to us by human meanings. But there are also, and this is again the greater part, there are also things which are constituted both by divine meaning and by human meaning in cooperation. Does that help you a little bit
No,
with
that's
what?
great. That's great. That's great.
Okay.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why Lonergan's book Insight, the subtitle is a study of human understanding and not just a study of understanding. because there would be that problem of elision that God also understands.
Yeah, I just found a journal that had a review of Saving the Appearances and Insight in the same issue in 1957.
Oh, no kidding. Would you email
Yeah,
me that?
yeah, I'll try to find that for you.
That
I'll try
sounds
to
really
find it
interesting.
again
I'd love
for
to
you.
see that. Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay, good. I don't even remember where we were. So somebody want to pick up where we were or start a new thread? Or I'll read one of the emailed questions. We can do whatever you want. Uh, Kyle wants a
Could
copy too.
I jump in with a question about
Please.
this, going back a little bit to
Yeah.
gosh, were we on page 55? Sorry, no, I've lost it. The dogmatic versus the theological with like the biblical question.
Yeah.
Um, and this is coming from a Catholic um kind of perspective because I'm thinking about the early 20th century Pontifical Biblical Commission statements about Scripture, which involve things like saying Moses is the author of the first five books of the Bible.
Right.
And that was the commission was an organ of the magisterium, like it had the authority to teach things
Yep.
um, formally. And those statements, decades later sort of get voided. Is that a technical term?
Yeah. It is
Forgotten conveniently.
forgotten. Yeah, forgotten is maybe the I had a teacher at Marquette. Sorry to, don't lose your train of thought, but I had a teacher at Marquette uh, who's since passed, who wrote a very good article about the theological significance of forgetting.
Mm.
That
Oh, that sounds cool.
handing on and remembering are important, but what we forget is often just what we forget is often just as important. Anyway, but continue. Don't yeah.
Sure. Um, and so while that commission was operating, like doing dogmatics, they were stating things that were questions more proper to historical
Hmm.
study.
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't know what to do with that exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Um, if each of these modes have different methods available to them, and one sort of like crosses the boundaries of the method, maybe. What's yeah, so what to do with that?
Yeah. Um, and that just doesn't come up here, right? Uh, sorry, that's
Right.
not a satisfying result, but right, it's just not contemplated here. Um, Partly for reasons of context, right? I mean, we're talking pre-Vatican II priestly formation, um, and Humane Generis was promulgated a few years prior. Um, there are going to be certain my friend Jacob always reminds me that you know when you deal in t church teaching, you have to keep in mind that yes, uh, there's a theological component, but there's always also just a historical and political component too, and they're integral to one another, frankly. Um, so yeah, so Lonergan will, as we get going, you'll start to see um, Lonergan's sense that part of what's missing there is a kind of lack of methodical control for how one moves from the data on divine revelation to judgments about what has been revealed that are proper to the teaching authority of the church. And here they're just all the way in brackets. It's one of the limitations. Now, that being said, I don't think Lonergan was obtuse to the problem or the questions. Um, he he said of these textbooks, and in fact, this is from this is from one of two textbooks in his year-long Trinity course. The first term Trinity textbook is the tri is De Deo Trino Pars Dogmatica, or the dogmatic part. Part of which was published as a book called The Way to Nicaea, in which Lonergan tries to show the sort of essential intellectual elements of the development of the Nicene position. Uh, and then, right on that basis, he wants to be able to, in the next term, in the next term of the school year, pivot over to these systematic questions. Um, and Lonergan would say later that part of the reason he ends up writing Method and Theology is because he just found it impossible to try to teach in um, in an ecclesial context in Latin within the confines of what was sort of permitted as a matter of policy and piety, and also deal with all of the questions that modern historical methods and historical mindedness raise about, boy, that I was raising in my class with Stephen Long. You know, how the heck do we get from A to M here, let alone from A to Z? Um, and really give an intellectually adequate account in light of, intervening textual and philological and lexical and archaeological, and on and on and on. So in some ways, Lonergan's doing his best here, but he's very clearly kind of setting down fence posts about where the boundaries of what he's up to are, and he's just not even, and he's not looking past them. And I think some of that is a kind of strategy for just like, at some point you got to get in the classroom and teach the thing under the curricular circumstances you're facing. So yeah. So anyway, sorry, none of that is probably a very satisfying answer, but hang in and we will get a number of different formulations related to your question that might help you ask the question in a more pointed way. Um, to really get Lonergan's answer to that question, we'd have to have a second class where we read Method and Theology, um, which I don't know. Uh, Bug Paul, maybe he can talk me into it. Okay, good. Somebody had one in the chat here. Hmm. Oh, we've got a Maximus question. Um, so the question is, I mean, you can see in the chat, but given what you said to Nate, how does the natural theology distinction hold for Lonergan, or perhaps, in other words, does Lonergan reject St. Maximus' view of logoi and creation and scripture all being revelation? Don't feel you have to address that today or ever. I think the really the short answer that will make it sound simpler than it is yes. Um, but the subsequent maybe interesting question would be, how much does Lonergan do that from on principle from out of his own philosophical view, and how much does he do that because he's just like a post-Vatican I 20th century Catholic? Um, you know, Lonergan came into the world wrapped in a culture too, and an ecclesial culture on top of a broader secular culture. So, um, yeah, we can maybe at some point maybe we can dig into those questions. But I'm going to give you the short answer and then the subsequent question for now. How's that sound? Okay. Any other questions people have ready to go? Oh yeah, Michael, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. On page 24 of my document, page 53 of the book,
Good.
in the first full paragraph, there's a sentence where he talks about eventually it becomes clear that a truly satisfactory answer to the initial problem demands that a generation that is unique and completely unknown to us from any other source has to be arrived at, et cetera, clearly conceived and formulated. The word generation there, I take to be synonymous with the word insight or understanding, but I've never come across him using that word to describe or to indicate that event. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that. Like, is there some technical specificity he's trying to get at here, or is he just writing really quickly, or what?
Lonergan um, rarely dashed things off. Um, Method and theology being in some ways kind of an exception, which I mentioned before. That I mean, even that was quite what do you say, lapidary. Um, but uh, but he would draft and redraft, and um, so let me look at this one more. So let's read the whole paragraph. But a properly theological solution is something of a different kind. Um, oh, let's go back actually. Let's go back even a little more. The theological solution differs from the dogmatic, right? So this is going to be something to just keep in. This is one of those like, if you don't get anything else from this, make sure that you get this, right? That for Lonergan, the dogmatic and the speculative or the systematic are going to be distinct tasks, right? We're not trying to figure out what it is that we affirm is true, but we're trying to understand. We're trying to figure out how to understand what we've already affirmed is true on the basis of faith and authority. Um, when as a dog, this is down at the bottom. Yeah, very good. When as a dogmatic theologian, one determines that the Son of God was not made but was begotten, one is not introducing anything hypothetical. One is drawing together, pondering, and understanding what has been revealed. The name Son is in fact used of Jesus in a singular way. The same one who is Jesus cannot be numbered among creatures. Many predications are made of him that are proper to God. Pull all of them together, and you do not have to add anything hypothetical in order to affirm that the Son was not made, but that he is uncreated, divine, and born of God. So here he's alluding to the work he's done in the previous textbook in the previous term. But a properly theological solution is something of a different kind. When one asks what sort of thing that birth or generation in God is, so being begotten, one has, in a very brief way, virtually posed a large number of questions. But not all of these questions come to mind at once. Rather, as time goes on, different questions occur to different investigators. Many are solved through revelation or through naturally known truths, but these very solutions prompt further questions, right? So notice in the background the unrestrictedness of the desire to understand, right? Even if you get really good answers, sometimes the even more value comes or the greater value of a particular answer can be that it kind of unlocks a gateway to a new horizon of questions that if you didn't have that answer, you wouldn't have had access to, or wouldn't have occurred to you, or at least would have not very probably occurred to you. Until eventually it becomes clear that a truly satisfactory answer to the initial problem demands that a generation that is unique, so a kind of being begotten, that is unique. So this is an allusion back to Jesus being called Son in a singular way.
Got it.
All right. Well, he's called Son because he's begotten, but he's begotten in some forgive my foul mouth, but sometimes when I'm teaching and we get to the creed and I'm walking people through the Nicene Creed and I say the only begotten Son of the Father, whatever the fuck that means. Right. I mean, that's kind of what Lonergan's saying here, right? Is that, yeah, you get this term, but as soon as it says begotten, not made, you go, well, now I don't know what begotten means anymore, except I know it means not made. Whatever it means not made. So he's not a creature, but you still have this question of like, yeah, but what does that word mean? And so what he's saying is that the effulgence of the questions that arise about what it could mean are the thing that suggest it whatever it means is going to be a kind of unique case. Um, Unique, completely unknown to us from any other source that has to be arrived at and clearly and distinctly conceived and formulated. Now, an idea that is arrived at and conceived and formulated in order to provide a solution to a specific problem is, as such, a hypothesis. So, um, here's something that maybe you noticed or maybe you didn't, is that, and one of the things I really like about this procedure is if one puts forward a hypothesis in an effort to answer these questions that arise out of one's encounter with dogma, and that hypothetical solution to these problems that emerge doesn't work out, you're not heterodox. It's not heresy. Because you've already affirmed the doctrine, right? And heresy is a matter of denying what the church affirms is true as a matter of revelation. And so, as a theologian myself, I'm in the dubious position of being one of these things professionally. Um, it's enormously liberating that I can pawn off a certain amount of responsibility for defining what the church teaches on, if not the bishops and the limit, at least on the dogmatic theologians, among whom I cannot be counted. And all I have to do is notice which questions arise when I affirm the doctrines as I understand them to be put forward by the church, and then try to come up with hypotheses that might address them satisfactorily. Um, and if I mess it up, well, we're just back to where we were before, which is where we had questions about the teachings of the church that we all affirm is true on the basis of our faith. Um, so I don't know. I just want to make sure we notice that the way he's conceiving of the systematic or speculative task is one where, because it begins from dogmatic conclusions, uh, there's a certain amount of intellectual liberty that's built into the thing because you're just not in danger of right. At worst, what's going to happen is you're going to discover that your hypothesis doesn't work because it actually implies the truth you began from isn't true. So now you know your hypothesis doesn't work. You still affirm what the church teaches is true. Try the next one. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? I don't know. I feel like I'm going in circles, but
No, that makes good sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And oddly enough, Homburg, as radical as he is, clearly stays within that same box in all of his speculation.
Interesting.
Which is why von Balthasar can write the afterword to Meditations on the Tarot and not have any bad feelings about it.
So, can you say a little bit more about that for people who might not know?
Yeah, so Valentin Homburg was a disciple of Rudolf Steiner, who converted to Catholicism. And he wrote a whole bunch of books, but the book that he's most well known for is actually a work that he wrote anonymously that was not published until after his death. The book is called Meditations on the Tarot, and it's the subtitle of it is an exploration of Christian Hermeticism, and it's an analysis of the symbolic meaning of the various symbols of the tarot deck, and he interprets them through a unambiguously Roman Catholic lens. So that's Tomberg.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Cool. Good.
So is this an instance of him creating an analogy or demonstrating or referring to an analogy between the operations of the mind coming to understand and formulating a hypothesis and generations in the Trinity?
Interesting.
Using the word, he uses the word generation in that one sentence,
Yeah.
and then he uses the word idea in the next sentence with the same language following it.
So no, it's not an analogy to hypothetical discourse per se. What he's doing is he's sort of foreshadowing what the rest of the book is going to be about, which is expositing Thomas on the Trinity, where the first question is the question I brought up earlier, whether there can be any procession in God. And Thomas's analogy he's going to use to defend the idea that yes, there can be, is the act from act procession of the verbum mentis from the active intelligere, of the inner word from the active insight. So that's the parallelism you're picking up. That the singular creaturely instance of act from act procession that's going to be our analog for act from act procession in the Godhead is going to be the generation of concepts from understanding to the generation of the Son from the Father. the speaking of the word. So that's what he's alluding. It's not as narrow as it's you're in good Lonerganian mode, sort of trying to catch him, doing rhetorician, but it's not quite as narrow as hypothetical discourse. It's just understanding in general is going to be the analogy. Yeah. All right.
Could I jump in with another question?
Yeah, please.
So this is back to page 15.
Great.
So right before he lists off um, the 10 properties of the act of understanding the mystery that one is doing in theology, he seems to be distinguishing that from catechetical understanding. And could you give examples of the difference between catechetical understanding and this thing that he goes on to talk about?
It's so funny. He drops that category of catechetical understanding, and it's very, I have always found it a kind of alluring category, and he never circles back and develops it really. Um, I think he gives an example of it in he wrote two versions of a talk, um, one in the early 60s and one in the early 70s, called The Origins of Christian Realism. And for sure in the 1972 version, I can't remember if he does it in the other one, but for sure in the 1972 version of Origins of Christian Realism, um, he leans on Athanasius's, he calls it Athanasius's little rule, that everything you would say about the Father, you would say about the Son, except that the Son is not the Father and the Father is not the Son. Um, so that would be an instance of catechetical understanding, um, of how do you hang on to, um, the nature person distinction, right? Athanasius's rule would be a way of doing that in a catechetical way. All right. Anything you would say about uh, the Father, you would say about the Son, except that the Son is not the Father and the Father is not the Son. Um, at least as to the Godhead in say. If you get into the missions, it gets more complicated, right? Um, Lonergan develops this a little bit to say, essentially, I'm not going to be able to quote him off the top of my head, but essentially what he says is then, in terms of catechetical understanding, um, what are divine persons? Divine persons are what there's three of in God. What is the divine nature? It's what there's one of in God. Does that help me understand the substance of what divine personhood is, or what the divine nature is? Nope. But it keeps me from making hash of the basic claims about, divine revelation, what the church teaches, even sort of how I narrate the economy of salvation, right? Um, so when I teach the Trinity, I totally steal this from Lonergan, right? I drill my students, right? In the hypostatic union, what is there one of? Person. What are there two of? Natures. In the Trinity, what is there one of? Nature. What is there three of? Persons. Um, you could do it in terms of who questions and what questions, right? Who's incarnate? Uh, who's incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, the Son. What is incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth? God. Right. Those I would give all those as instances of catechetical understanding. Mike.
I'm just wondering if he returns to that notion in chapter 1 of Insight when he talks about nominal understanding. So you have just
Yeah.
enough understanding to use the words in the sentence correctly, and you sort of know what they mean. Maybe you
Yeah.
can, but you
No, that's
don't.
interesting.
You're not able to like run with it.
No, and part of the reason that's interesting is that, Lonergan scholars tend to hold up nominal understand. They tend to use nominal understanding as a pejorative,
Yeah,
sort of merely nominal understanding.
right,
Um, but that would be an interesting case in which nominal understanding would be a very needful sort of stage in intellectual development.
right.
You got to learn, you got to learn how to talk about this mystery that you're gonna be continuing to engage, God willing, for the rest of your years. Um, yeah, maybe. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that might be right.
Well, I mean, outside of theology, that kind of characterization would apply to almost everyone's knowledge of almost everything.
Yes.
I mean, really. So it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
really
yeah.
that unreasonable.
No, it's
Yeah,
true. I
yeah.
mean, that's the thing that if I may ride a hobby horse for a moment. I mean, one of the things that Lonergan has to offer in his laser focus on understanding is if you hang with it, you can get a kind of you get a kind of clarity about when and what it is to be thinking, when you're thinking and what it is to be thinking. And you'll start to realize that there's all kinds of conscious processes and events and activities that are broadly and colloquially associated with thinking that are very much not thinking. And uh, if you go to the comment section of social media, you see lots of people doing a lot of talking um, on the dubious premise that they're thinking about these things. Uh, and if you engage them, especially if you try to engage them with fresh insights that try to reframe the discourse, you'll notice that a lot of what you get back are these kind of weird scripts that don't really engage with what you said, because they didn't understand, and they didn't notice that they didn't understand. Um, and so, all sorts of imaginative and psychological processes drive the continued discourse, but not understanding. And so, I think one of the philosophical and humanistic values of studying Lonergan, aside from the theological ones, has to do with his real rigor about making sure that you appreciate and distinguish in your own consciousness, thinking from all the other stuff that goes on. And you realize
Well,
how much people mostly aren't thinking.
right. And then you add on top of that the transcultural problem that he talks about, which is actually now even worse because of the internet, right? So what Barfield called the collective representations, or in some places he called it mental habit, for most of our history, it's come from the macro culture level. Not anymore.
Yeah.
Not anymore. People that live in the same macro culture have completely different collective representations and literally see reality differently because of it.
Yep. Yeah. Lonergan, Lonergan defines a community as people with a common set of meanings and values. Um, and so it's not, yeah, it doesn't matter that you're neighbors. And it doesn't matter that you get your mail from the same post office. Um, it's hard not to, well, now I'm going to get melancholy, but it's hard not to think about the former Yugoslavia. Um, and, militants who would show up at your door and hand you a gun. In 1996, my dad went to Bosnia. He was a TV news reporter. He did a series of stories about people recovering from the war there. Um, and he heard over and over again people tell the same story, which is that militants would show up at your door and they'd hand you a gun and they would tell you that you needed to kill your Muslim neighbor or they would kill you and your whole family.
Yeah, the guy who ran the volunteer office that I worked out of for the Andrew Yang campaign back in 2020, he had been a helicopter pilot in the Army,
Hmm.
and he said that the one thing that he feels good about that he did in his entire term of service in the U.S. military was participating in the rescue mission in Bosnia.
Wow.
Like he said, that's the thing that he feels good about.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, yeah, now I'm in a Brown study. So ask me a question that's exciting and will return to me my love of learning.
Is it possible that by catechetical understanding, he's simply drawing on, to come back around, if I might, is he
Yeah.
drawing on kind of the Baltimore Catechism's almost genre, where it's just this like question, two-sentence answer,
Yeah.
next question,
Yep.
two-sentence answer, and it just sort of
Absolutely.
is like that's what catechetical understanding is. And if you go beyond that, now we're doing these sorts of things. Is
Yeah, I
that
think that's right.
okay?
Yeah. No, I think so. And I think that's why later on he gives that example of, what is there one of in God? What is there three of in God?
Hmm.
Kind of way of proceeding. Which again, if that's all you get is pretty thin gruel. but as a place to start, can be totally sound, right? You know.
No, thank you. That's helpful. I had kind of my own parish experiences of catechesis, and
Mm.
right now our second grader going through First Communion, who's like asking questions that are very clearly beyond just like, here's the script and don't ask more questions. Like, so I'm like,
Yep.
so catechesis is more complicated than just
Yes.
regurgitating the sentence. But
It's
if he's
it's
drawing
where
on
you
just ballpark
start.
catechism, okay.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, it's I have Bill, I'll get to you in just a second, but I forgive me if I talked about this last time, but did I tell you about the thought experiment I have students do? Uh, okay, maybe I didn't. Um, I do a thing with my students where I say like, look, I want you to imagine. I mean, they're between 19 and 25 mostly, and I say, I want you to imagine some important part of your life, your romantic relationships, your finances, something that's going to be a important element of your living. And I want you to imagine, just as a mental exercise, that in that area of your life, you only have as much insight and understanding as you had at 13 or 14. Every other area of your life, you can deepen and grow and develop an experience and wisdom. But in that area, all you have, what you were able to cobble together by about eighth or ninth grade, that's all you get. And then I say, and that's what a lot of people, when it comes to religion, are walking around with. Um, Oh, I talked about it when I talked about it with Paul. Yeah. That's what people are when it comes to their religious understanding, that's what a lot of people are walking around with. Sometimes because they didn't have an opportunity to deepen it, but sometimes because they were actively discouraged from deepening it. Um, and like I think I probably said to Paul, look around. How's religion going? How's it going out there? Okay, Bill, sorry. Go ahead.
No, no worries. And it's funny, I just listened to that interview like a couple of hours ago, and that's been
Oh,
rattling around in my head, that exact thing. I'm like, I'm definitely going to talk to my 15-year-old about that because,
yeah.
yeah, he went through confirmation about a year ago, but it's just something I want him to keep in mind going forward.
There's more to
But
get.
yeah, yeah. But this is another kind of fairly simple question, I think. But you brought up that I had written down earlier. You brought up understanding. I thought I'd go. I just mentioned. I think I get the gist of it just from everything you've said and from the reading. But like for Lonergan, what's the distinction between like understanding, knowledge, and wisdom? And
Oh, good.
I was also curious how this maybe relate to like judgment or sensation. Is that
Good.
related to?
Yeah, here, he kind of walks through it here at one point. Let's see if I can remember where. Okay, so give me just a second. I'm trying to find a particular thing, and I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. Mm, Okay, I'm not finding the thing I wanted to find very quickly. So knowledge. I can go through it this way, and then Kyle has a question we'll get to next. Um, Knowledge is the term and goal of cognitional process. Um, and the um, the act which achieves knowledge is judgment, and it consists in an affirmation or negation, right? Yes or no. Lonergan uses Aristotle's formulation as received through Thomas, right? The question that you're answering when you make a judgment is it so? Is it the case? But the antecedent to that pronoun, it, is a content. So judgment is a kind of thumbs up or thumbs down. later on he'll complicate this in terms of sort of probabilistic claims, right? Is it likely true or unlikely true? But both of those things are sort of set on a spectrum. The ends of the limits of which are affirmation and negation. Is it so? Yes, no. You can kind of hedge in between, but it has an antecedent, and so judgment has a borrowed content, and it borrows its content from if a judgment is a reflective understanding, right? Lonergan will say a grasp the sufficiency of the evidence, right? Is it so? If you know your Karl Rahner, conversio ad phantasmata, you turn, you sort of pivot from the rational procedure to an empirical one, and you try to see if the evidence holds up for your idea. And the apprehension that the evidence is sufficient or is insufficient is also an understanding. It's an insight. Um, but it's a reflective insight. And so it's an insight that has a borrowed content, which is to say, it is about some hypothetical understanding, or Lonergan sometimes will also call it a direct understanding, which is an answer to the question of some form of, what is it? Quod est in Latin. What's going on? What's the nature of this? Why is it this way? Something. These are all examples, right? Um, and so, the example Aristotle gives is, why is the moon thus darkened? Why is this lunar eclipse happening? Um, and uh, and so then the hypothetical answer to that has to do with the arrangement of celestial objects, um, and the your hypothesis about what constellation of celestial objects would produce the moon looking like this, right? You can then sort of run the calculations, and if you can predict when there should be another lunar eclipse, and then on that predicted night, bang, there's your lunar eclipse. That's evidence in your senses, right? In the phantasms of the correctness of your hypothesis, the correctness of your insight. So, what's the nature of a lunar eclipse, right? Or why does the moon look like that? You have an insight into the constellation of celestial objects, and then then you either go on the hunt for or wait around for evidence that that hypothesis is correct. It's important to get that both direct insight or hypothetical insight and reflective insight are both acts of insight. They're both apprehensions of intelligibility in some data. Um, and so you asked, so did I get all the way through, right? So knowledge is the term of cognitional process. Judgment is the act in which that term is achieved. Judgment is the affirmation or negation which answers a question, a reflective question, like is it so? It does it on the basis of the sufficiency of the evidence. The it and the is it so is a borrowed content from a hypothetical insight, which is a kind of an intellectual possibility that one grasps in the presentations of data, whether those data are data of sense or data of consciousness. Um, okay. Did that make sense? And if so or if not, what other questions do you have?
It did. I was just wondering how either of those relate to like wisdom.
Oh,
What is
wisdom.
wisdom
I
from
knew
that?
I left
Yeah.
one out. Good. That is a highly abstract account of cognitional process. One question, one direct insight, one reflective question, one judgment, right? Bing, 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 bing. We were talking about, you know, Second graders on their way to first communion. Does your kid have just one question, Pat, about the Eucharist?
Yeah.
No. Lots, right?
Hmm.
Okay. Um, Pat, I have a second grader who is also on her way to First Communion. And the thing, and Lonergan notes this in a few different places, right? Part of the thing about kids' questions is they're an exuberant expression of the native human desire to understand. And that exuberance is evidenced in part in their chaotic emergence or their occasional emergence, let's say, right? They spit those questions out at the rate and in the order those questions occur to them. Now we become adults and we become more polite. We come up with all sorts of fancy ways to stifle this exuberance, much to our own detriment. But also, though, is part of how that stifling can occur is in an encounter with the frustration and the befuddlement of our parents and our teachers, because they're having to field these questions in this exuberant, semi-chaotic order, and there's all kinds of stuff that a kid would have to already have on board for adequate answers to those questions to be meaningful. Right. Um, right. So, my son Oscar a few years ago asked me if God makes mistakes, right? And I can tell him no, but he wants to know, yeah, but why not? Okay. Um, how do I okay, so Oscar, have you ever heard of Actus Purus? No? Okay, well, damn, let me take another angle. Um, so wisdom in the cognitional realm, right? There's all kinds of other kinds of you can read the first part of the Summa Contra Gentiles and Thomas gives different examples of martial wisdom and medical wisdom and stuff. Um, but wisdom in the cognitional realm has to do with grasping um, grasping which questions are primary. Which questions would you need answered first in order for the answers to the subsequent questions to be meaningful to you? And so, the way Lonergan reads the St. Thomas's Summa is as a series of quadlibital disputations, but that are arranged in a sapiential ordering. Um, and it's not, and it's interesting that you notice that that the Summa doesn't proceed in the manner of a treatise, beginning with the sort of logically elementary or the logically basic elements, and then build them out into a big rational edifice. Um, but rather, he thinks that Thomas was proceeding according to a via doctrina, a way of teaching, guided by wisdom about which are the properly basic questions that need to be answered for later answers to be meaningful. But wisdom in the broadest sense pertains to ordering, has to do with setting things into order, taking the multiplicity of things and putting them into intelligible and good wholes. Cool. All right. Other questions? Here we. Oh, yes, I was going to answer Kyle's. Okay. Let's all jump to page 97. Hmm.
Kyle's showing off that he read that far.
Yeah. A likely story. Okay. Lonergan makes a comment on theologians that seem to praise biblical or patristic theology at the expense of later theology. Are these possible reservations broadly he had on aspects of the Catholic ressourcement movement? All right, let's take a look at what he says. See what we think. And I'm going to make a little comment too about um, a thing that appears a couple times in this, and that may or may not appear again in another essay as well. I'll start at the bottom of the previous page. Oh, let's start. Let's start. There are three ways of making the transition. So can we go up a little bit? Thanks, Paul. There are three ways of making the transition to the systematic without achieving a synthesis. First, this is another thing about insight that Lonergan takes from the classical tradition is that understanding grasps unities and heads towards unities. And so that's why there's what he calls a systematic exigence. As you get aggregates of answers to questions in your effort to understand, there will be an intellectual pressure to figure out how that aggregate synthesizes into a structure, into a synthesis. Um, First, the philosophical handmaid can be so dominant that theologians are occupied at great length with questions that are at root are philosophical. I'm probably guilty of that. Second, theologians can attend to both speculative and positive issues, but achieve not a joining and a synthesis, but just a juxtaposition and an aggregate. So this is like what the books of sentences were, right? They were aggregations of people's answers to theological problems. Third, system itself can be so exaggerated that positive elements become superfluous since they can be demonstrated. So he's thinking of sort of semi-rationalist theologies here. The first tendency can be seen quite clearly in the decadence of the 14th and 15th centuries, but it also troubled later theology. The second tendency occurs when apologetic exigencies combine with philosophical domination. The third tendency appeared in 19th century semi-rationalism, whose short life was ended by the First Vatican Council. In parallel fashion, when synthesis is lacking, there are three ways of going astray on the positive side. The first is an archaism that tempts people to reject at least the later syntheses and return to a more ancient, simple, pure stage of Christianity. Um, with apologies to the present Church of Christ people. Um, Lonergan has. We're about to get into. This is a good place to uh, pause and make a claim. Lonergan stops doing this, interestingly, after the Second Vatican Council, but in his career before the Second Vatican Council, he rehearses this declension narrative that was a kind of commonplace in Catholic theology in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century, which is basically that it's been resurrected by RO folks sometimes that theological mistakes in the late medieval, early modern period give rise to the Reformation, and the Reformation gives rise to modernity, and modernity gives rise to everything that's wrong with everything everywhere. Um, and so I read these things when I read these things for the first time. I read them myself as a Protestant, and so I did my best not to take offense, but didn't totally succeed. Um, okay, where was I here? The second is a futurism that tempts people to bypass earlier and later syntheses alike and to accept some new and as yet unheard of overview of everything. The third is the tendency of those whose minds are so exhausted by a plethora of weighty theories that they settle for certitude and exclude all understanding. Um, right. The magisterium says it. I believe it. That settles it. Um, you can trade in whatever authority you like on that, as you like. Now, the 16th century reformers and the later pietists extolled a scriptural archaism. Those are my people, the pietists, by the way. The followers of Bias and Jansenists wanted a patristic and Augustinian archaism. Always good to get a dig at the Jansenists if you can. Nor are theologians of our own age immune from the same tendency, who so praise biblical or patristic theology that they almost seem to prefer to omit all later theology. I think you can reasonably infer that that's a dig at certain excesses of Nouvelle theology. Um, Now, Lonergan is almost certainly not taking a dig at the big name folks you've heard of. Congar, he thinks Congar's great. Um, he had a kind of mixed opinion of de Lubac, but he certainly thought de Lubac was a towering figure. Those kind of big name guys you've heard of, he would not be alluding to, but probably more. Um, uh, oh shoot, I'm blank. I'm so bad with names. I was going to name a couple of sort of third tier figures that Lonergan every once in a while would hold out for quick but pithy opprobrium. Anyway, if I think of it, I'll put it in the chat or mention it later or something. Uh, but yes, so Kyle, to answer your question, I do think that that is a dig at least certain elements of the Nouvelle Théologie. Futurism is seen in liberals and modernists who suggest that not only Catholics and Protestants, but also the fathers of the church and the New Testament authors themselves were mistaken regarding the true nature of the Christian religion. Finally, the third error consists not in the division of labor but within positive studies, which is quite proper, but nor in insisting on a solid analytic foundation for the way of synthesis, which is also quite proper, but in so highly esteeming the necessity and solidity of the positive path as to end up with a positivistic exclusion of speculation. Um, so this is the sort of conclusions theology. For a while, I taught in a seminary in San Antonio, and I would occasionally teach intro to philosophy for guys who were uh, permanent diaconate candidates. And by the way the schedule was set up, I would always get them the semester after they had taken their course in the catechism. And so the first paper I got from them always was just citations to the catechism and no argument. Um, that's what Lonergan's talking about there, right? Guys who have a compendious knowledge of like Denzinger or whatever church documents, and they take citing the authorities to be sufficient to settling all matters of understanding and speculation and synthesis. Anyway, okay, Kyle, I probably well more than answered your question there, but let me know if you want me to touch on anything else. Okay, yeah, no problem. So what time is it? Tell you what, let me take a quick look at these two questions that John sent me, so that hears them addressed in the recording, albeit close to the end. And then I want to say sort of one more thing about Lonergan's characterization of its procedure, and then we can all move on with our lives. Okay. So John sent two questions. One is there seems to be an educational paradigm at work in Lonergan's understanding of the process of theology. The growth of wise judgment in dogma and of keen understanding in systematics is a learning process for the church, intergenerationally via tradition and collaboratively among the living faithful. How might religious sponsored educational institutions today learn from Lonergan amidst the significant change and plurality of values we find in our society? That's an obnoxiously practical question, John. And then the second question is Lonergan talks about a theological system as solving current problems and contemplating future development. Given his philosophy is highly engaged with modern science, can Lonergan be rightly called a systems thinker? Oh, that's interesting. Not just in the sense in which Thomas is a systematic thinker, but in which Ludwig von Bertalanffy is a systems thinker in biology. Not something I know anything about, John, so I probably can't weigh in, though I'd be happy if other people do. What does this mean for understanding Lonergan's project? Okay. I'm going to punt on the second one, but I will talk about the first. Um, okay, so one of the difficulties in addressing that question with regard to this is a textbook created for an educational context that essentially doesn't exist anymore. Pre-Vatican II, um, you know, Catholic preparation of priests and other religious. Um, and some of the ways in which Lonergan sets out the parameter. I mean, his like almost exclusive reliance on Thomas Aquinas, right? Even in a Catholic context, that's not going to fly anymore. As much as Thomas continues to be privileged in a Catholic context, like that's just in a post-Vatican II context, that's not gonna work. I had an interview for a job once in which somebody asked, one of the questions I got asked in the interview was, does everybody have to be a Thomist? Um, and it occurred to me at that moment I might not be getting this job, and it might be good. Um, but that's a certain limitation on sort of extrapolating from this. However, I do think one of the things that can be valuable in a pluralistic society for Lonergan's procedure here, and the United States is an interesting example because especially higher ed, we have a kind of maybe uniquely variegated higher ed system in the United States. Lots of different kinds of institutions from lots of different traditions. Um, is I think it can be quite appropriate for different institutions to have their own intellectual and moral cultures, and consequently to sort of have their own, to borrow a term from political science, to kind of their own Overton windows, um, in which part of we speak of the mission of institutions, um, in which participating in that institution means to some greater or lesser extent um, signing on in advance to a set of affirmations, both cognitive and evaluative, which is to say certain to affirm certain truths and to uphold certain values. Um, and and if you're not willing to do that, you might not be, as the bureaucrats say, a good institutional fit. Um, And so then, but there is a kind of modern mentality that chafes against that, and not for nothing. That you don't want to get into a situation in which that kind of concreteness and particularity becomes a kind of closure or a kind of occlusive, anti-intellectual, uh, obscurantism or something. So how can you still have a robust intellectual culture in an institution, an educational institution or otherwise, where, yeah, there's just certain parameters in terms of, look, if you're going to do this, if you're going to be here with us doing this thing, you need to be able to affirm certain things as true and certain things as worthwhile. Um, and I think the model that says, well, okay, uh, being a part of this community involves these antecedent affirmations. Still, because the desire to understand is unrestricted, you can still have an unending, ongoing, very open-ended discourse about, okay, we agree these things are true, but how do we understand them? And how do they fit together? We affirm that these things are good, but what are the best ways to achieve them? Um, have we been too narrow in our conception of what achieving them might look like? Right? The giving free rein to the mind is not at odds with having a kind of determinacy in terms of the meanings and values that make up a community or an institution. And I think that's an interesting, especially in a pre-Vatican II, post-humanic generous, kind of high stakes Catholic context like the Gregorian, um, to be able to come up to be able to spell out a scheme by which there is at once this antecedent cognitive and evaluative determinacy, and also within that, this kind of radical intellectual openness um, is a valuable two-step to be able to do. It might be hard to maintain. I wouldn't make any kind of, I wouldn't have any pretensions to it being easy. Um, but I think it sets out what is, to my mind, a kind of plausible model for how you would do it. I don't know. What do y'all think about that? Is there an element of this that might be address John's question better than I'm doing it? I don't know. What do you think? I've exhausted you. Very well. Okay. So last thing. I want to draw your attention to one thing and then we'll get out of here. Huh? This list. Right now I'm looking at 33. Just because it's a nice pithy statement of the litany here. Fourth, again on 33, as theological understanding itself is imperfect, analogical, obscure, gradually developing, and so on. So also the consequent inner word and the consequent outer word are imperfectly, analogically, and obscurely understood. So there's a certain what would you say? Management of expectations here. And he's managing these expectations with direct appeal to the pronouncements of Vatican I, right? That language of imperfect, analogical, obscure, gradually developing, he'll add to it fruits, nevertheless fruitful. Um, that language he's drawing all from the documents of Vatican I. So he's on firm magisterial ground here. He's and he's already said, right? Theology is a science analogically, not univocally. And the reason for this has to do with our relationship to its object. That theology, properly so called, is an effort to understand God. Um, and he's gonna lean on, he doesn't, I don't think he, oh, maybe he does cite it actually, I think, on the formulation of Lateran 4 about analogy, right? That, any there are real similarities between creatures and the creator, but any similarities can be matched by a still greater dissimilarity. Um, and so, uh, you know, Lonergan wants us to keep in mind um, that we should have a sort of set of a corresponding expectations about how theology is going to go, how much we can really get out of theological understanding. Um, Now, in part, he's doing this because there continued to be a kind of highly confident, even triumphalist, rationalist. He calls it conclusions theology um, that set out magisterial definitions of doctrine as premises, and then made deductions from them. And then took the conclusions to those deductions to have the same certitude as the certitude of one's affirmation of magisterial pronouncement, and also as the same certitude one has in apodictic demonstration. Um, and Lonergan thought this was an oversell. Um, in Grace and Freedom, and I think it's in the dissertation version in Grazia Operon's a dissertation. Um, he sets the analogical part out, I think, a little more clearly than he does here, where he basically says, like, look, as we investigate the economy of salvation, as we investigate salvation history, some things that we ask about are going to just be creatures. Some things that we're investigating are going to be proportionate to our minds as creatures. And so our expectations of our capacity to know them, at least in principle, can be the same as kind of anything else. Um, but in the properly theological questions, there's going to be, in salvation history, there's going to be, because grace is a created communication of the divine nature, the way he's thinking about it. I'll say that again. So grace is any created communication of the divine nature. It means that your investigation of these things is going to be a mix, that there's going to be creaturely elements and there's going to be elements that pertain properly to the divine nature. And he thinks the trick is is to have sufficient methodological clarity to be able to delineate those things which you're going to be able to get proportionate human knowledge on, those things which are properly hidden in God, in the infinitude of the divine nature, um, and then to be able to pivot between them by making analogies from creatures to the creator, recognizing the limits of analogy as an intellectual technique. Um, something to notice is that this Thomistic emphasis on the technique of analogy, um, it's going to kind of disappear from Lonergan's approach to theological method. Once he's out of this Thomist pre-Vatican II um, context, this analogy as a technique is just if he still believes in it, he just doesn't thematize it. He doesn't bring it up almost ever, as far as I can tell. I haven't done like a systematic study, but it just drops off. So a question you might keep in mind as we continue to read is, how much of Lonergan's Thomism survives the transition from a pre-Vatican II into a intra-Vatican II and then post-Vatican II context. So that's just a question I'll leave you with as we go on to read is be on the hunt for what Thomist stuff can sticks around in its own terms, what Thomist stuff gets transposed into a new idiom, and what Thomist stuff just goes away. All right, now you've exhausted me.
Actually, can I bring up
No, please go ahead.
just one last thing building on
Yeah,
that?
please.
There is a point in the text where there's a little hint at something beyond theological understanding here. This is page 113.
Great.
And he references Saint Thomas's mystical experience at the end of his life, and then he talks about Saint Teresa. He says, "Granted that the greatest of theologians at the end of his life came to experience God's gifts as vastly superior to all theological achievement. It
Yep.
also helps to remember that. But then he wants to remember that he wants to remind you that theology still has value, and then he follows it up and says, it also helps to remember that Saint Teresa considered the advice of a genuine theologian more useful than that of a saintly priest. So
Yeah.
he
he's
wants
kinda-
mysticism and theology to work hand in hand.
Yeah, I think, and I think he wants us as readers not to, um, he's burning a lot of calories. He's spilling a lot of ink on this theological understanding thing. And I think, at this point, I have that page dog-eared. Thank you for getting to it because I wish I had intended to talk about it. Yeah, he doesn't want us to forget that this is one he thinks sometimes neglected, pretty significantly misunderstood, an important element of Christian life and thought. But yeah, he doesn't want us to forget that it's just one, and it's embedded in a whole.
Yeah, I would like to see what he would do with the work of someone like John Vervaeke, because I think he was clearly working with a model of cognition that was limited to the propositional only, and did not have any notion of human cognition being more expansive than merely the propositional.
Who is that? Sorry.
Dr. John Vervaeke, he's a cognitive scientist and self-identified Neoplatonist.
Okay.
Yeah. He's a friend of mine. I can point you, if you want, I can point you in the direction of some of his stuff.
So it'll be interesting. Yeah. I will. I'll put a flag because the emphasis on the propositional here is something that is another thing that we can ask whether that survives or not. Because we're not going to look at it, but well, actually that's not true. We're gonna get little premonitions of what in method and theology he's going to develop as the domains and functions of meaning, and they're everything from the sort of elemental meaning of light cast by a sunset to the incarnate meaning of a person. And so his that emphasis on the propositional you're getting here, we should also keep in mind, does that get qualified? Does it get rejected? Does it get decentered? That's another thing. That's another good thing to raise.
Good. Good.
That's going to be on the move too.
All
Okay.
right. All right.
Thanks, y'all. Much appreciated. If you think of questions, send them to me.
Thank you, John. Great stuff. You're
Thanks, John.
firing on all cylinders today.
Totally. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
All right. I'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks.
Appreciate
Okay.
it.